You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hi, everyone. This is Scott. If you want to learn about the world's oldest civilizations, find out how they were rediscovered, follow the story of Mark Antony and Cleopatra's descendants over 10 generations, or take a deep dive into the Iron Age or the Hellenistic era, then check out the Ancient World podcast. Available on all podcasting platforms, or go to ancientworldpodcast.com. That's the Ancient World Podcast.
Hey everyone, thanks for tuning in to episode number 521 of our Civil War podcast. My name is Rich.
And I'm Tracy. Hello y'all, welcome to the podcast. As y'all will recall, we've been talking about the action at the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain on June 27, 1864. According to Sherman's Special Orders 28, each federal army had a part to play in his plan. To the south, Schofield was to continue harassing the Confederate left flank by advancing along the Powder Spring Road and threatening to push toward Marietta.
Meanwhile, some of McPherson's troops from the Army of the Tennessee were to make a feint against the northern end of the rebel line by sending forward clouds of skirmishers to occupy the attention of the Confederates on Big and Little Kennesaw. At the same time that was happening, McPherson was to launch an attack against the rebels just to the south around Pigeon Hill.
McPherson's part in the plan was itself meant to be a distraction and designed to keep the Confederate commander, Joe Johnston, from moving reinforcements south to support the rebel troops that would be hit by the main federal assault made by George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland.
So far, we've covered the action on McPherson's front, and then by the end of the last show, we were getting a start on what was happening with George Thomas's Army of the Cumberland. In fact, Newton's division of the Federals was just about to kick off their attack, which was going to hit the portion of the enemy line held by Patrick Cleburne's Confederates.
As the pre-assault bombardment by the 4th Corps artillery batteries started to wrap up, the Union infantry of Newton's division braced themselves for the task at hand. A newspaper correspondent from Cincinnati was present to record the final moments before the attack and the tension that filled the ranks.
Quote, "During the brief respite that ensued before the order to charge was given, the men rested silently in their places, and no one could have guessed from their undisturbed faces that all the latent gallantry of their natures was to be aroused and lashed into a fury of heroism during the next 10 minutes.
In the center of Newton's line and spearheading the division's attack were the 5 regiments that comprised George Wagner's brigade. According to the Assistant Adjutant General of 4th Corps, Lieutenant Colonel Joseph Fullerton, Wagner's brigade, for whatever reason, wasn't ready to begin the assault at the appointed hour, that is, at 8 o'clock, and didn't start to advance until 9 a.m.
Wagner reported that no sooner did his men begin to advance than the Confederates across the way, quote, opened a terrific and deadly fire of artillery and musketry from their main line of works, end quote. Blue-coated soldiers from Indiana, Ohio, and Kentucky were blasted by shot and shell fired by Alabamans, Mississippians, Arkansans, and Tennesseans. One Arkansan in Cleburne's lines recalled, "If any command was ever given for us to commence firing, I never heard it. It sounded as though we had 100 cannon instead of 8 or 10, firing with such regularity One would think they were on parade drill, and like our infantry, they shot for execution. The Yanks got as far as the gully, which to them seemed at that time the healthiest place to halt. One would imagine Mount Vesuvius had moved over to the Confederate States of America and opened up a business on Kennesaw.
Some of the Federals reached the obstacles in front of Cleburne's lines and, while under heavy fire, tried to push, pull, and clear the impediments out of their way. In a letter to his brother 4 days later, Sergeant William Jones of the 26th Ohio said, quote, "Men were falling all around, but we pressed forward. The rebels had pointed stakes driven in the ground in front of their works, and our men were shot down while trying to pull them out. The firing became too heavy. We were repulsed."
Wagner's men twice surged forward, but could not get past the obstacles in front of the Confederate works. Newton sent word to Wagner that Nathan Kimball's brigade was moving up to support him, but for the moment, that was of little comfort for Wagner's men pinned down by the intense rebel fire. The 26th Ohio's color bearer was killed, and Sergeant Walden Kelly noted that, quote, "The flagstaff was shot in 3 places, and the colors bore the evidence of the 56 bullets that had passed through them."
Coming to the aid of Wagner's embattled brigade was Nathan Kimball, an officer who had gained experience leading troops both before and during the Civil War. Before 1861, Kimball was a physician at home in Indiana and a captain of volunteer infantry during the war with Mexico, when he distinguished himself at the Battle of Buena Vista.
With the outbreak of the Civil War, he again volunteered his services to the Union and led troops in combat in the Shenandoah Valley and at Antietam and Fredericksburg, where he was wounded. When he recovered from his wound, he took part in the siege of Vicksburg. Here in the Atlanta campaign, the 41-year-old Kimball was a brigade commander in Newton's 4th Corps Division.
Kimball's brigade was originally intended to be placed behind Wagner's to support his attack. However, due to the terrain, Kimball's brigade was instead placed on Wagner's left and given orders to advance only if Wagner needed assistance.
And so, shortly after 9 a.m., Kimball's brigade was ordered to advance in an attempt to retrieve what was already a desperate situation for Wagner's brigade. The regiments in Kimball's brigade were made up of men from Illinois, Wisconsin, and Missouri, and as they moved up on Kimball's left flank, they were stymied by the same difficult terrain and heavy enemy musketry and cannon fire that had broken up Wagner's attack. Lieutenant Colonel Porter Olson of the 36th Illinois reported that the strength of the enemy's works and the volume of his fire made success seem like, quote, "an impossibility on our part of the line."
Among the Federals hit during Kimball's advance was Adjutant Andrew Potter of the 74th Illinois, who was fortunate to be struck by a spent bullet. In a June 30th letter to his sister, Potter told her, "At first I thought I felt the blood spouting out against my clothes, but it proved to be the violent pulsations of my heart."
With the soldiers in Wagner's and Kimball's brigades pinned down in front of the Confederate works and unable to come to grips with the rebels, by 10 a.m. Newton had sent orders for them to fall back. Sergeant John Marshall of the 97th Ohio recalled that the terrors of the withdrawal were just as bad as those suffered while advancing, if not worse. Quote, "The slaughter among our troops at this moment was even greater than when they advanced, for the enemy now rose from behind their works, fearless of danger from the retreating force, and fired with greater precision than when we advanced."
As the Federals fell back, Captain Robert Davis Smith of the 2nd Tennessee noted that, quote, "the slaughter was terrific as our troops literally mowed them down."
Wagner's and Kimball's Federals had had little chance against Patrick Cleburne's well-entrenched Confederates, who needed to do little except load and fire as fast as humanly possible. After negotiating the difficult terrain, very few of the Yankees managed to push their way through the obstacles in front of the rebel entrenchments, and of those who did, the intensity of the Confederate fire meant that actually piercing the enemy line was an impossibility. Not even 2 hours had passed from the time Wagner went forward, Kimball advanced, then they received orders to fall back. Together, the two brigades suffered about 400 casualties in their futile attempt to crack Cleburne's lines.
To the right, that is south of Wagner and Kimball, 28-year-old Brigadier General Charles Garrison Harker was having his own troubles at the same time.
Harker was a New Jersey native who graduated from West Point in 1858. In 1861, he was commissioned the colonel of the 65th Ohio. A smart, capable officer, he saw service at Shiloh, Stones River, and Chickamauga, earning the respect of his men and the praise of his superiors. In fact, after Chickamauga, Harker was recommended for a promotion to brigadier general.
While the promotion became official in April 1864, Harker didn't receive his commission letter until June 7th, just 20 days before the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain. Of the day Harker received the letter, Colonel Emerson Opdyke of the 125th Ohio said, quote, "We all rejoice with him."
In a July 1864 letter, Oliver Otis Howard recalled that when he assumed command of 4th Corps, he wanted Harker to become his chief of staff, but Harker declined, choosing instead to remain with his men, and thus showing the same, quote, "independence of character and uprightness of conduct," end quote, that Howard had noticed in him when Harker was a cadet at West Point and Howard was an instructor there.
Earlier in the campaign, shortly after the fight at Resaca, Harker wrote a letter to his sister noting that, quote, "But a few steps from where this is being penned, I see several newly made graves, the number constantly rising by the fall of gallant officers and brave men, and before this reaches you, thousands of others must fall. Who they will be, God in his infinite wisdom alone knows."
Although he had been in combat several times before and come through all right, Charles Harker appeared to have had a premonition of a battlefield death at Kennesaw Mountain. On the morning of June 27th, he gave some of his personal effects to one of his aides, along with instructions for what to do if he was killed in the fighting. And Harker chose to remain mounted at Kennesaw, even though he'd had 4 horses shot out from under him in previous battles. Here, he said he, quote, "anticipated a desperate struggle."
With 8 regiments from Illinois, Ohio, and Kentucky, Harker's brigade was larger than Wagner's or Kimball's. Division Commander John Newton personally tapped Colonel Opdyke of the 125th Ohio to lead a strong screen of skirmishers to, quote, "clear the front of the attacking columns, go smack up to the rebel works, and pass over them if possible."
To those orders, Newton added the warning, quote, "You will have heavy work to do." Well, the 34-year-old Opdyke chose his own regiment, the 125th Ohio, to be a part of the force of skirmishers. During the fighting at Resaca, he'd been badly wounded in the arm, but had recovered sufficiently to lead his men at Kennesaw in late June.
Harker's advance began around 9 a.m., after the skirmishers, led by Opdyke, had worked their way to within about 400 yards of the Confederate lines.
The strong Federal skirmish line advanced at a brisk pace, capturing or driving off their rebel counterparts until the Yankees reached the obstacles in front of the Confederate works, at which point they were hit, in Opdyke's words, by a, quote, "withering fire."
As the rest of Harker's men came up behind the skirmishers, the Federal soldiers struggled to push their way under fire through the abatis and stakes in front of the Confederate entrenchments. Captain John Tuttle of the 3rd Kentucky U.S. recalled the Confederates kept up a, quote, "murderous fire."
Some of the Federals managed to bull their way through the obstacles and advance into the teeth of the Confederate fire to reach the enemy entrenchments, and some accounts report that both the 51st Illinois and 27th Illinois actually managed to plant their flags for a brief time on the rebel works.
But the Federals who managed to reach the Confederate works were too few in number to secure a lodgment, and they soon began to waver in the face of the intense rebel resistance.
With his brigade's attack stalled and the situation beginning to look grim, Harker sent word back to 4th Corps headquarters that the Confederate defenses to his front were, quote-unquote, formidable, and that the assaulting troops from 14th Corps to his right seemed to be giving way. Then, while urging his men to make one more push, Harker rode forward until he was only about 15 yards from the Confederate entrenchments. As his horse was struck multiple times, Harker was hit as well when a bullet punched through his right arm and entered his body. Seeing him go down, some of Harker's men rushed to his side, and several were hit while attempting to carry him off the field. But eventually he was got safely away, and command of the embattled brigade fell to Colonel Luther Bradley of the 51st Illinois.
It didn't take long for Bradley to reach the conclusion that the situation was hopeless, and the cost of staying put, pinned down in front of the Confederate works, would be the destruction of the brigade.
Captain Tuttle had made it far enough forward that, quote, "The concussion from the enemy's cannon nearly unjointed my neck, and the heat from them burnt my face." He admitted that when the order to fall back was given, a torrent of blue-coated soldiers began rushing toward the rear. Quote, "Our men rushed back like an immense herd of buffaloes, running over and trampling each other underfoot."
Here with Harker's men, as had happened to Wagner's and Kimball's brigades, these moments were as bad as the advance, if not worse, as Tuttle recorded that the Confederates, quote, "rose up and poured a murderous fire into our backs."
The spot where Harker's attack hit the Confederate lines was where the divisions of Patrick Cleburne and Benjamin Cheatham linked together. On Cleburne's left, the brigade commanded by Lucius Polk, the late Leonidas Polk's nephew, was positioned next to Cheatham's rightmost regiment, commanded by Alfred Vaughn.
Because Vaughn's brigade followed the crest of a ridge line, it curved to the west, which meant Harker's Federals attacked into an angle in the Confederate line, a kind of reverse salient, and so received deadly fire from two directions. The effect of this crossfire was terrible on the advancing Yankees.
An officer on Hardee's staff, W.L. Trask, described the fight against Harker's brigade, writing, quote, "They advanced with gallantry worthier of a better cause, and succeeded in planting a stand of colors on top of our breastworks. But all who mounted our works were either killed or taken prisoners. The assaulting enemy was everywhere repulsed with frightful loss."
During the furious struggle, a sergeant in the 29th Tennessee grabbed the flag of the 27th Illinois, capturing it as a prize of war for the Confederates.
At the tail end of Harker's assault on the Confederate works, the volleys of musketry from each side and the rebel cannon fire created a literal firestorm in front of the Confederate lines. Private William Barnes of the 1st Arkansas described the hellish scene. Quote, "As mentioned, our cannon were placed for execution. Their redoubts so low, the cannon's mouth nearly on the ground, and at every discharge a blaze of fire sprang out among the dry leaves, which were soon ablaze and eating their way toward the gully, which was full of a mass of human beings, squirming around and still piling on top of each other. Ah, but little can a peaceful citizen imagine the horror of war. Just one glimpse of that seething mass of weltering human beings, flames leaping with every discharge, the flying, burning sticks, the everlasting roar of cannon and small arms.
The pinned-down Yankees, most of whom were wounded and unable to move away from the flames, were caught in what Barnes described as a, quote, holocaust of dead, wounded, and living Federal soldiers.
The thought of watching from their works while the nearby Federals burned to death was too much for some Confederates to bear. Colonel William Martin of the Consolidated 1st and 15th Arkansas Regiments said, "Boys, this is butchery." Then he climbed atop the parapet and waved a white handkerchief to signal a halt to the firing.
The firing stopped, and there was a momentary truce, which extended over into Lucius Polk's portion of the Confederate lines, where fires had also started in front of the rebel works. As Union soldiers helped their wounded comrades get away from the danger zone, Confederates stepped out into what, just moments before, had been a killing ground and assisted them.
Private Barnes noted that the Yankees were, quote-unquote, fully appreciative of the ceasefire and the assistance they received from the Confederates. The momentary truce was a rare moment of humanity on June 27th in what was otherwise a grim, brutal fight. In his diary entry from the day, Captain Tuttle wrote, quote, "The rebels were generally very kind in allowing us to help off our wounded."
Aside from the brief truce to save the wounded Union soldiers from the flames, Fourth Corps' assault during the Battle of Kennesaw Mountain was a disaster for those Federals who charged the Confederate works.
As the men of Newton's division pulled back, they left behind a scene of carnage and suffering. But Captain Albert Tilden of the 51st Illinois, in a letter to his mother the following day, maintained that although the attack had failed, quote, "Our loss showed that we gave them a fair trial, considering the circumstances."
However reassuring that letter was, Tilton was wrong in his assessment because the Confederates hadn't been seriously tested by the Federals of Wagner's, Kimball's, and Harker's brigades.
In his memoirs, Joe Johnston claimed that Cleburne's command suffered only about a dozen casualties that day. In comparison, Newton's division lost more than 650 men in the span of a few hours. While that number isn't as high or as drastic as those for other divisions at battles such as Chickamauga, Spotsylvania, or Cold Harbor, for the Union soldiers who endured the fight, the words of Wilbur Hinman, a veteran of Harker's brigade, captured the experience of charging the Confederate lines at Kennesaw. Quote, "We never found a hotter place during all our 4 years of service."
Of the reason why the attack failed, Hinman could only state that, quote, "It was not possible for mortal men to pierce that strong and well-defended line."
And among those mortal men who tried to break the Confederate line and were cut down in the process was Charles Harker, who, after being wounded, was carried to the rear and evacuated to a field hospital. He lingered in pain for a few hours before succumbing to his wounds. The young general died around 1 o'clock that afternoon, with David Stanley and John Newton at his side.
Colonel Emerson Opdyke, who was a friend of Harker's, was also at the field hospital after the fighting ended on the 27th. Opdyke was checking on men from his command who had been wounded in the assault.
In a letter to his wife, Opdyke told her, "I took each by the hand and tried to encourage them. My heart ached for them. After such a scene, one could hardly help crying out, 'How long, O Lord, how long?'" Of Harker, with whom Opdyke had grown close, the colonel could only write, "He, the brave and pure-hearted, has gone to his rest. He was a noble sacrifice offered for the noblest of causes."
That means it's time for this episode's book recommendation. And our recommendation this time is Witness to War, the story of the Civil War told by those who lived it, by J. Mark Powell.
This book is hot off the presses. It was just published, but we got a sneak peek at it pre-publication and were very impressed by it. And we've just been waiting to recommend it to you guys. It's a collection of first-hand accounts from more than 500 letters, presented chronologically from Fort Sumter to Lincoln's assassination. So the war unfolds through the words of everyday people, soldiers and civilians, Union and Confederate, white and black, men, women, and even a few children. We hope that you'll check it out.
You can find a list of all of our book recommendations, including Witness to War, if you head over to the podcast website, which is www.civilwarpodcast.org.
Also at the website, you can find info on joining the Strawfoot Brigade over on Patreon and supporting the podcast in that way, just like Kelly, Henrik B., and Yanan S.
And Vinay V., Jeff D., and Kyle B.
A big thank you to all of you. We appreciate your support. And then thanks to all of you for listening to this episode of the podcast. Tracy and I do hope that you join us again next time, but until then, take care.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.